Hi, this is Lighting 3D for VFX Part 2. This is going to be covering Nuke compositing from a 3D artist perspective. So I'm going to just show you how to create this basic slap comp. That's what people call it if you're just a CG artist, just putting things together. But I'm also going to show you how to rebuild the lights as well, so you can actually control them, because when I've worked as a lighting TD in larger companies, you end up doing this breakdown of your lights for faster changes and to save a lot of rendering as well. So timestamps will be in the description below, and if you want to download this Nuke script, then there will be a link below. Also the Maya scene, which looks like this, you can download that. I will put another link, but this is actually the video of me creating this is the part 1 of this series. But as you can see, we've basically got a few render passes. So we've got ambient, occlusion, shadow pass, and then the beauty. And inside the render settings, I'll just quickly show you the passes. So we've got the Z, we've got crypto matte, we've got crypto object, diffuse, emission, shadow map, specular, specular indirect. And the thing to note is that the specular direct is the only one that has all light groups turned on. So in the part 1 of the tutorial, we created these lights, and within each light, so if I just select this key light here, we added the, we changed this, because normally it says default, to this is the AOV light group, and it separates the lights. So then we can rebuild the specular of the render, which is pretty cool. Okay, so I've done the renders, and what you'd have to do if you download this script, you would just have to relink the renders pretty much. But I'm going to leave this in the setup so you can basically see how this is built. But this is very basic. I do not claim to be a compositor in any way. So what I'm going to do is just rebuild what you see here. But first things first, actually, let's look. This is the original render. So this is super basic slap comp. So this is the footage, and then the render, and then create a merge node. To create node, you hit tab. So to do that, I hit tab, started typing merge. There we go, and just plugged the render in the A slot, and then B. B you can just imagine as back. So A over B, and that is how it looks. So when we're creating slap comps for lighting, you know, you won't always do this because with the bigger companies that do a lot of breaking down of specular direct passes, they have a lot of pipeline infrastructure that allows you to re-render and up version. But if you don't have the ability to do that, the only issue with doing this is that you'd have to refresh a lot of these passes. So it can become a bit painful if you've got a lot of different CG renders. So yeah, it's not always that wise, but it's pretty cool if you if you want to use it. So anyway, let's start with the CG render. So we've got this. I should get the footage. I'll just copy and paste it from the side. As I said earlier, there will be timestamps in the comments, so you feel free to skip ahead to whatever you need. Right. So this clip is just from an old short film as well, so feel free to use it. So I'm going to hit M, which is a hotkey for merge. Okay, so I've just created. So this, what we want to do is, as we separate these passes, we're trying to rebuild this. And the purpose for rebuilding it is so then we can actually control different elements. So what I've just done is I hit tab, typed in shuffle, and so what we want to do is shuffle out the passes. If this is the basic setup, then we need to separate this CG. So let's move this up a bit. So we need to get the diffuse out. So I had a diffuse AOV. So I'm going to rename the shuffle just so I don't get confused. I'm going to call it diffuse underscore, shuffle underscore diffuse. Oh, yeah, I already made this. I'll just call it diffuse 2. And you click here where it says RGBA, and you'll see a diffuse. I should mention now that in my render scene, I actually, before rendering this, I change in the common tab, you can find a bit called merge AOVs. This creates one single EXR with all the AOVs, like render passes, inside it, which is good and bad. An error that sometimes comes up, which would pop up at the bottom, is when you're using light group AOVs, if you try and turn on merge AOVs at the same time, you will get an error coming up saying, you know, duplicate image drivers. And basically what that's saying is, let's say for Specular Direct, oh wait, yeah, you can see. For Specular Direct, I changed it from the default where it says EXR and then you have these two symbols either side. You need to change it to just EXR so it creates a fresh separated file. Because there is like a conflict, and I know this has been happening for years in Maya. Anyway, let's jump back to Nuke. So diffuse, that's what the diffuse looks like. Great. So let's just copy and paste this node, and then we want to get out the, let's do Specular Direct, so then I can show you a super simple way of rebuilding your render. So I'm just going to abbreviate it and call it 2. So spec-dar2, Specular Direct 2. That's what that looks like. So that's all our speculars combined. And let's do, what was I doing over here? Oh yeah, just the indirect. So indirect, that's secondary bounces, then we need that one as well. So let's go, let's find it. Where is it? Specular indirect. Let's rename this underscore spec underscore indirect direct 2. Just abbreviating 2. And what we want to do is the multiplication we want in this merge node is we want these to be added on top of each other, basically. So plussed onto each other. So what we could do is create a merge node by pressing M on your keyboard, change the operation to plus, and one by one, we could just start putting these together. If we look at that, and then we look at that, so we look at the original render, you notice I just disconnected that there because we're trying to rebuild this. So now these are all separated. So this is the result of shuffling out these 3 passes, so diffuse, specular direct, and specular indirect. And now the original render, if I'm reading that, see there's no difference at all. I'm pressing 1 and 2 to switch between them. That's a great result. Okay, so what that could mean is at this point you could just separate that. If you want to do some basic corrections, then you could hit tab, search for, because we're going to make some exposures in a minute, but if you just wanted to dial down all your exposure, what you can do is, all your reflections, then what you could do is add an exposure node after your specular direct, go to adjust in, change it to stops, and now whenever you move this up 1 or down, it should be very similar, if not the same, as in Maya, changing the exposure down 1 or 2. So then I can type in -1. You'll see it changes in all the color values. And then when I look at my render, my comp here, compare it to the original render, you can see it's already having an effect. So all the lights now effectively have been brought down by 1 exposure. It's pretty cool. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I will leave that there, but I will just disable this one and this one. So now we are back to, so this is indirect and diffuse. Right, now what we need to do is we need to shuffle out all these other specular directs. So what I might do is, actually I should redo it from scratch really, just so you get the understanding. Well, I'll do one and then I will fast forward the next bit. Okay, so what you want to do is get a shuffle node, plug it into the CG, then find your first light. It doesn't really matter on the order. Specular direct, so I'm going to pick card projection light. So I named them so they would make sense to me at least, and hopefully some other people. And then after that, we can hit tab, search exposure, and like I did before, change adjust in to stops. I'm going to rename the shuffle node to spec dia underscore card proj for projection, and then I'm going to add O2 just because I have duplicates in this Nuke script. Great. Okay, so now I'm going to pause the video and basically repeat this process, but for all the other lights.
6.5 hours later.
Okay, so now what you could see is I've separated out all the separate specular direct passes. So if I just go back into Maya, show you what that was. So in the render settings, I will go to specular direct. I will click on that, and you see all light groups. That was highlighted. So it will render a separate iteration of each light's specular direct contribution. So every single light, if I just click on one, they all have different names in the AOV light group. So those two things then allows us to do this setup in Nuke. And you can see I'm plussing them all separately. I could in fact connect them all to the same merge node, because you could do two, I think you could do two A's, but I can't fully remember how to do that right now. But you can plug them all into one. However, doing it separately adds another layer of control, because you see in here, if I double click on one of these plus signs, we've got the mix, so we can literally blend different specular directs as well. So let's look at the bottom of here. So just to check, if we look, so these merges are the specular direct from all our lights. Then you see we have the diffuse and the specular indirect. And when I look through here, this bottom, then that's how our render looks. And let's look at the beauty render. So it looks exactly the same, which is great. So now that means if I double click on one of these exposure nodes, you'll notice the adjust in is changed to stops. And what I could do is I could do -2, and you see that's brought back our ground direct specular reflections. And if I disable this node, you'll see what it looks without. So if there's one particular light you don't actually like, you could rebuild like this and then just disable it, or just not even shuffle out this, so delete all of that. But in this instance, I think this ground light is too bright, so I would probably just bring it down by 2 stops. And then if your supervisor, what would happen if you work as lighting TD in a big company, when they would give you amendments, and then you would make the changes in this similar way, and then if they're happy with it, you would go back to your 3D package like Maya, Katana, Houdini, then change that specific light. So if my supervisor was happy with this, with the -2, then I would go back into Maya and find the ground light and then just reduce it by 2 exposure and re-render. So it's pretty good. Okay, right. So we've separated this. So that's how you build the basic render, but you can see I did a few things. So I'm going to show you what happens next. So if we then apply it over the plate, you'll notice, something's gone a bit weird. So there's a few ways to fix this. But if I hit tab, search for copy, this is just a lazy man's way, and then I will just put the copy node. What's happening is, as we're breaking this render into separate elements, we are effectively losing the alpha along the way. So then we just want to bring it back in, pretty much. I'm just gonna break this apart. And as you can see, so I made this copy node, you see rgb.alpha, rgb.alpha. All that's doing is it's grabbing that information from that original render, because if I look at the original render, press A, we have an alpha. But then after my comp breakup, if I press A, there's nothing there. So we're losing it along the way as we rebuild this. That's not particularly big deal. Okay, so now we have the renders. And what we're going to do now is we can add in our ambient occlusion pass, which you wouldn't always render. You know, technically it's not reality because it's fake reflections, but you know, some companies still render ambient occlusion just to fade over. So you can just press M to make a merge node. This is what the ambient occlusion looks like. You can see it's a bit of slight bit of shadowing. I would change the operation to multiply, plug in the A, and let's look at it with the plate on. So let's disable it, so before and after, so that before and after. It's a bit heavy, so I guess I would probably do 50% maybe, so 0.5. There we go, let's do it before and after, so before, after, add something a little bit, but you know, not much. Now let's add in the shadow pass. I'm just going to copy and paste from the other part of the comp. That's why I built this earlier, just so I could easily copy and paste from these different file paths. You will have access to all these files. So this is a separate render, even though if we created a layer contact sheet, so if you want to look inside a CG render, which is a multi-layered EXR, you can create a layer contact sheet node, press show layer names, and you will see the result you get out from each. So in this particular one, this pass I actually called shadow matte, when in Maya it was shadow pass. The reason for that is the shadow matte pass with the original render is not very useful, basically. So to save memory, what I could have done is in my shadow pass, I could have swapped to that, pressed the I, gone to the common tab, right click on the merge AOVs, and done create absolute override for visible layer. And oh, where has that gone? And now turn that off, and you see it's highlighted orange, which means that there's not going to be merge AOVs on this render layer. Or we could also turn off, we would also you know, turn these off as well for that render pass. But yeah, sometimes having merged AOVs isn't always great because the files can be massive and very heavy and just crash Nuke. Anyway, let's continue. So yeah, I had to alter the shadow pass. That's why we have a separate shadow render. So I'm creating a shuffle node, and I will shuffle out the shadow matte. So let's have a look. What is there? Okay, cool. We have white. Let's create a merge node. Just drop it next to the footage. Do A over B. As you can see, beautiful. That's white, so we're going to invert. Let's change the operation to a multiply. And now let's look at the plate. Look at that, shadows. So before and after. They're pretty noisy. I could have turned up the samples, but blurring would probably be added, so it doesn't really matter too much. Yep, so that's helped. Cool. What else? And then there would be extra adjustments you would do to your CG, but as you know, if you're doing this like slap compositing for VFX as a CG artist, you wouldn't really have to do any of that because you want to show your supervisors basically the result pretty pure out of the 3D package. So that's why it's quite a basic comp I've got here, and you will get if you download the scene files. But if you wanted to make any other adjustments, you know, depending on the company you work at, they would do things like add a denoise. So they would denoise the footage first. So then you can re-add noise to the footage and CG together. Because if you look, this is very pristine in comparison. The footage, there is no film type noise on this. So there are a few things we would do to the render. Initially, I would probably add a bit of a blur in this instance. You would get probably a Z depth pass. You could turn on the Z pass in Maya. You'd probably have to set it up. And then you could add a grade in nodes. You just have to play around with that, or you can color pick your black and white points from your footage, or just, you know, play around. I don't know, I'm not a compositor. And then you could add in your color correct, do a few more tweaks. I'm just putting these here as an example, and then add in grain, a bunch of presets, and you can get more online as well. And then we could just, I don't know, change that to something else. So let's do before and after from these final changes. So yeah, adds a little bit more, sits it in a bit better. And there we go. That's pretty much it. So I'm gonna leave it there. That was quite quick, but this is pretty much how I would do a quick slap comp setup for CG when I'm working, you know, in the day-to-day. The breakdown of specular direct passes, what you can see here, that's more what happened in larger companies on massive films, but you know, it can be a good way of breaking down renders. It just depends if you have the time and the infrastructure to do that, the pipeline as well. But yeah, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to give it a like and subscribe. And if you sign up to my Patreon as well, you will get all the files for this video and about 7 before to download for free, so you can follow along with the tutorials and have all the files. I hope that helps. Cheers.